So this session is maximizing the best with a focus on grades 3 through 5. I am Holly Slaughter. I know most of you. My title has changed this year. I know, this is big stuff. Last year I was the elementary reading and language specialist, reading and language arts specialist. Now I'm the 3-5 reading and language arts specialist. I know. So Cassandra, who was K2 specialist for Transformation Zone only, is transitioning this year to K2 district. So I will be focusing a lot of my efforts around grades 3 through 5. So it's exciting. So anyway, today in the next 50 minutes, here is our outcomes and agenda. We're going to work collaboratively together. The first half of the session is really going to be around the book itself, right? Digging into the book, marking up pages. We're going to move really fast through that part. Getting to know the strands, the standards, the benchmarks, the mapping, how the book is designed. And then the second half of the training, which is my favorite part, is us really engaging in some tasks, kind of thinking about putting your school leader administrator hat on. So if you're walking into a classroom and you're seeing certain practices, taking those practices and relating them back to the strands, standards, and benchmarks. Okay, so bear with me. The first part is going to go pretty quickly, and then the second part, I'll ask you to engage in some really fun stuff. All right, you should have a book. This is a B.E.S.T. book. It's yours to keep, so mark it up. This book is the same book that your 3 through 5 teachers are getting in summer training if they came. And if they didn't come to summer training, you want to encourage your 3 through 5 teachers that they must sign up for a B.E.S.T. session during DWT. They'll get this book, okay? This book, while it starts with all the front matter and ends with all the back matter, it's specifically designed for grades 3, 4, and 5. So we'll start with the book. You should also have Post-its on your table and some highlighters, so I'll ask you to mark certain spots, certain pages. We'll dig into it and go from there. So go ahead, and I'm going to invite you to turn to page 7. And page 7, you'll find the EEs or the ELA expectations. ELA expectations are these overarching skills that run through all the components of language arts. So these are skills that you should expect to see in all parts of the ELA block. So go ahead and take a look at your EEs, and you'll see that these are skills like citing evidence, right? Justifying reasons, inferencing or inferring, collaborating in groups, right? These are all things that we want our students to understand and be able to do in the language arts block to make sense of what they're reading and they're writing. We'll turn back to these EEs throughout our time together as well. Go ahead and turn your page and mark this standards map on page 9. So I'm going to break down the standards map, and you'll notice again it's very different to our LAFS map. First of all, it begins with 4 strands, and the 4 strands are foundational, your foundational strand, your reading strand, your communication strand, and your vocabulary strand. Each strand is further divided into what are called standards. Remember, in LAFS, our standards were our end-of-year sort of benchmarks, right? That's not the same with B.E.S.T. Our strands are further divided into standards. Take a look. There are 10 standards. I know if you're looking at your standards map and you're saying, Holly, there are actually 11 standards. Look, Dawn is counting them. Did you count 11?
I did.
Okay. I didn't make a mistake here. We're focusing on grades 3 through 5. And so one of the things that in this time we're focusing on 3 through 5, but what I want you to notice in your foundational strand, it's further divided into 2 standards. The first standard addresses K-5. The second standard is for secondary, which is 6th grade and up, right? So we're going to ignore, right, that particular standard. So if you'll take a look again at foundations, you'll see foundation strand is further divided into 2 standards. One of them pertains to grades 3 through 5. And then the standards are further divided into 4 benchmarks, right? See that? Again, those 4 benchmarks, you see them on the screen: print concepts, PA, phonics and word analysis, and fluency. For grades 3 through 5, we're only focusing on 2 of the benchmarks. The first 2 benchmarks are K1, and then PA dips into 2, okay? But for 3 through 5, that standard, we're only focusing on 2 benchmarks. You can see reading is broken down into 4 standards. 3 standards. Reading literary text, reading informational text, and then reading across genre, right? Or reading prose and poetry, which is literary. Communication is the 3rd strand. Communication is broken down into 5 standards. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go back one quick. Reading across genre is broken down into 4 benchmarks. For K through 5, we only focus on the first 3 benchmarks. Understanding rhetoric is a benchmark that's specific to grades 6 and up. So if you're a K-5 school, right, we're not focusing on that benchmark. Communication, you can see, is broken down into 5 standards, and vocabulary, 1 standard further divided into benchmarks. So the language that we use to talk about the B.E.S.T. standards is a little bit different. 4 strands, further divided into standards, further divided into benchmarks, and then for us, we'll be coming back to this standards map again and again and again, but just know that those benchmarks are divided into grade level specific benchmarks, and those are what we're looking for end of the year expectations. The next page you'll want to mark, progression of foundation benchmarks. This is special. It's called out. You'll see there are 2 vertical progressions in the front matter. One is around foundations, and one is around the rest of the standards. The foundations are their own progression because they don't work in a spiraled manner like the rest of the standards. So they've called those out special. Again, you'll see the foundations are divided further into the standard, into the benchmark. One of the things, again, if you'll notice, just look at print concepts at the first benchmark, and you'll see the grade levels. And you'll notice that print concepts only applies to what grade levels? That's right, K and 1, right? And then again, phonological awareness. And then for phonics and word analysis, this is important for grades 3, 4, and 5. There are grade level benchmarks for phonics and word analysis, right? And there are grade level benchmarks for fluency. Make sense? All right, the next page that I want you to call your attention to, the spiraled standards in a vertical progression. I know many of you attended training for K1-2, so some of this is going to be a repeat. That's okay. Repetition is how we learn best, right? If you look at the reading standards, let's go ahead and look at, remember, this is the reading strand, right? Reading, prose, and poetry standard, and then literary elements benchmark. Okay, we're going to focus on the literary elements benchmark. I want to call your attention to the grade level benchmarks for grades 3, 4, and 5 for literary elements. And what we're going to do now is study the vertical progression to notice how the bold words indicate a change in complexity. So you'll notice for every single benchmark begins with kindergarten, and everything in kindergarten is in bold. Why is that? It's the first time they're exposed to it. But if you look at first grade, the words in bold indicate that change in complexity. It's a change in the standard. So it shows how the standard, it's the same, the benchmark, it's the same benchmark, but it grows in complexity. So let's, again, focus on just grades 3, 4, and 5. So for the literary element benchmark, grade 3, what is the literary element that our third graders are expected to focus on? So the literary element is character work, right? Our third graders need to be immersed in character work. Let's go ahead and look at our fourth grade. And I want you to notice the change in literary elements from the third grade benchmark to the fourth grade benchmark. What literary elements are we adding?
Conflict.
Okay, so in third grade, we're focusing on explaining characters. But in fourth grade, we're explaining not just characters, but we're also adding the literary element of setting, and we're also focusing on conflict. Now let's take a look at fifth grade. What do you notice? We've now gone from explain to analyze, right? So in third grade, kids are expected to make clear, right, how a character might be in the beginning of the text of the story, in the middle of the story, and the end of the story, right? Explain, to make clear, to give reasons, right? But in fifth grade, they're expected to analyze, study, examine, discover more. So when you analyze, you actually have to bring more to the text than what's there. And analysis requires kids not just to maybe read a text one time, but do that close-in kind of reading. The other thing I want to say about this particular benchmark, characterization is not bolded. It should be bolded, right? It's the first time we mention characterization. And characterization, doing some characterization work is kind of like dipping their toe in that archetype pool almost, right? Like getting ready to sort of think about archetypes and characters, where our fifth graders might do some characterization work and dig in and analyze characters and discover that characters are complex, right? They're more than one way. The bully is also insecure, right? And that these types of characters surface in books, right, over and over again. So that characterization work. Okay. So from a school leader role, when you are in a third grade classroom and teachers are teaching literary elements, you expect the level of teaching to be very different in third grade than you would in fifth grade. Not just in terms of the literary elements that they're studying and focusing on, but also the depth of complexity and the work that we're expecting from our students. Make sense? Okay. So let's take a look. We just studied, I'm trying to repeat it over and over again and repeat it in your head. We studied the strand of reading, right? The standard of reading prose and poetry, and the benchmark of literary elements. On that very same page, we're going to stick with the reading strand, the standard of reading prose and poetry, but now we're going to look at the benchmark of theme. Okay, so again, let's look at the progression from third to fourth to fifth in theme. What do you notice? What are the differences? Call them out.
So in third grade, you're explaining how the theme is developing, but in fourth and fifth grade, you're getting into explaining how a
Stated or implied, right? So explicit in that the theme might be contained in a sentence in the book, right? It's probably not going to say, and the theme of the story is, right? But yes, right? Sometimes we teach kids in 3rd grade to identify a pop-out sentence, right? A pop-out sentence from the book that sort of captures the theme of the book. But definitely the work changes. I want to shift just for a minute and think about the literary elements and theme and how those benchmarks work together. And so when we're teaching kids about determining the theme in grades 3, 4, and 5, we're going to kind of put some work together right now, right? Let's go back to those EEs, those ELA expectations. For kids to determine the theme, they're probably going to have to make some inferences. Agree? For kids to determine the theme, they're going to have to cite their evidence to justify their theme. For kids to determine the theme, y'all cannot teach theme without understanding character. Let's all wrap our heads around that, right? We have to be able to trace a character and the development of the character and how the character interacts with other characters and solves their problems or doesn't solve their problems from the beginning all the way to the end. It's critical in order to figure out the theme. A short example, because a lot of you know the book of Those Shoes. Who knows the book of Those Shoes? In the very beginning, the character, he wants. In the middle of the book, he really, really wants. In the end of the book, does he get the shoes? He does not get the shoes. But instead, he makes a friend. And so to understand the theme or a theme in that book, you have to understand the arc of the character from beginning to end, right? So all of these skills are necessary skills for a student to determine the theme. Have you heard about stacking? Right? This is what we mean by stacking. The spotlight benchmark for this lesson could be for students to explain the theme. But in order for them to explain the theme, they have to have these skills intact, right? They've got to be able to infer. They've got to be able to cite evidence. They've got to be able to understand character development. So if you go back to your book on page 6, what you'll find is the design of the standard. And the 4th bullet clearly states that these standards should not stand alone as a separate focus for instruction, that they should be combined purposefully. So that was an example right there, okay? How are we doing? We good? Okay. We're going to move now from the front matter to the grade level specific. And so I want to invite you once again to turn to page 25 and mark page 25 in your book as the grade level strands, standards, and benchmarks. Okay. Many of you have identified this goal in your SIP. Maybe it was an ELA-specific goal, but maybe it was a more content-agnostic goal, right? But identified the idea that teachers have to gain a deep understanding of the B.E.S.T. standards as a non-negotiable for improving student outcomes. So I would argue that while the vertical alignment that we just studied is super important, right? Understanding sort of like where I am situated, what did my students learn in the previous grade level, what are they learning in the next grade level? But even more critical is to understand my lane. So if I'm a 3rd grade teacher, not only is this organized by strand, standard, and benchmark, but I also get these benchmark clarifications. And in order to understand the full intent of the standards, I have to dig into these benchmark clarifications. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples. So if you look on page 25, third grade, you'll notice the first strand that we're addressing is foundational. It's the foundational strand. And the foundational strand is focusing on the standard learning and applying foundational reading skills, right? And that standard is further broken into two benchmarks, the word analysis and phonics benchmark and the fluency benchmark, okay? So phonics and word analysis. Go ahead and just take a second to read the benchmark for third graders. And then look right below that benchmark, and what do you see? The clarifications. And this becomes huge and important because if the benchmark says that students must be able to decode words with Greek and Latin roots and decode words with suffixes, right? I need to know, like, what does that mean exactly? And if I want to know what that means exactly, sometimes, not always, sometimes the clarification is just going to be right there for you. But sometimes it's going to steer you to the appendix, right? And in the appendix or the appendices, it's a wealth of information. So we're going to pause right now and turn our attention to the appendices. And I'm going to ask you on page 52 to mark Appendix A. And what I want you to notice is the beauty of this appendix. What this does, remember I told you we'd be coming back to those EEs, those ELA expectations again and again. Check out page 52. What it actually does is it takes each one of those ELA expectations and further clarifies the expectation by breaking it into grade level bands, right? So if the first expectation requires students to cite and justify evidence, right? How is that different in a 2-3 classroom or a 4-5 classroom or a K1? Because let's face it, even though we're focusing on 3-5 in this training, it gives you more of a clarification of what that would look like. And you can see the same is true for, let's see here. Use appropriate collaborative techniques, right? It's broken down into kindergarten, 1-2, and then it gives you like the full-on 3-12. But this is really nice. So mark that so you fully understand what those ELA expectations look like in different grade levels. Appendix B, which is on the very next page, page 53, this is explaining, giving clarification around text complexity. What do we mean by qualitative bands? What do we mean by quantitative, right? How is a text more complex? What does low complexity look like versus mid complexity versus high complexity? What about the students, right? We know that that's an important part of text complexity. Following that, you'll see on the next few pages are the grade level best lists. So you'll see there's a list for a recommended, I just made that word up. Recommended list for grade 3, grade 4, grade 5. The recommendation is that our curriculum contain at least 33% of the books on this list, and we're well over 50% in all lists. Most of the books, we have the whole text. Some of the books, we have an excerpt of the text. And you'll see when you look at the list, each one of the lists begins with not just books, but also poems. Okay. So if you'll turn to Appendix C, oh my goodness. Yes, that's a good question. Did you guys hear Chris? Are you going to be getting a lot of those books in your modules? At about 50% of those books, yes. Appendix C is all around the communication, Strand, so I love this because it defines the different types of writing. If you flip through it, you're going to get elaborative techniques, you're going to get narrative techniques, and then an oral communication, beautiful rubric. Page 72, there's a conventions progression. If those of you who remember conventions, if you please, if you're old like me and you remember conventions, if you please, we used to have something like this in that conventions curriculum. It's beautiful because of the way it's designed. You can see when a skill is introduced but not yet mastered, all the way through like mastery, right? When a student is fluent and fast at a skill. And then finally, I want to draw your attention to page 75, 76, and 77. Remember, we started this work, this appendix work, by looking at the third grade strands, standards, and benchmarks. We noticed in that first grade benchmark, they called out in the appendix the list of Greek and Latin roots and affixes, right? You have your prefixes and your suffixes. And that's what you're seeing right here. And then last but not least, and then we'll take a turn, I promise. This is about to get really exciting. Hold on to your hats. Page 84, mark your glossary of terms. One of the things I want to call your attention to is when we were studying the reading strand with the reading prose and poetry standard and the literary elements benchmark, we noticed a difference between the verb in the 3rd and 4th grade standard and the 5th grade standard. Who remembers what it was? Yes, we went from explain to analyze. Everybody give her a round of applause. That's her prize. Woo! Go ahead right now and use your glossary and look up explain and analyze. So one of the things that the state has done for us is they've said, okay, yes, we're changing the verb, we're making it more complex, but this, to understand the full intent of the benchmark, this is what we mean by explain, and this is what we mean by analyze, okay? And there are a lot more words in there that are mentioned throughout, that sort of academic vocabulary mentioned throughout the standard strands and benchmarks that we can turn to the glossary for more clarification. Last but not least, go ahead and mark page 34. These are your grade 4 standard strands and benchmarks. And you'll also want to mark grade 5 on page 43. These are your grade 5 standard strands and benchmarks, full with the benchmark clarifications and so forth and so on. I know that was quick going through the book, but we're going to shift our attention because this was all about us familiarizing ourselves with the language, right? Strand, standard, benchmark, how the book is organized, how we can use the book. Now we're going to engage in a couple of instructional tasks. And when we engage in the instructional task, I'm going to sort of take on the role as your 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade teacher. I'm going to ask you to participate for a few minutes, and then we're going to stop and we're going to debrief the task as if you are the school leader. You'll take on your school leader role, acting as if you had just gone into a classroom, and then thinking about breaking down the task and using the tools to analyze the task. Okay? Sound fun? Yes. Okay. All right. So in a minute, I'm going to give you guys a text, and we're actually going to read. This is riveting. You're going to read a portion of text from the Teaching and Learning book. So exciting. It's all about reading, right? But before we read this text, we're going to sort of study a word that you're going to encounter in the text. And the word is independently. What's the word? Independently. Yes, independently. Thumbs up if you've heard of that word before, independently. Yeah, We're going to study the word independently. So let's think about the word in parts, okay? So we're going to think about the syllables in the word independently. So let's clap the syllables. And as we clap the syllables, I want you to say the syllable as you clap it. Are you ready? Here we go. Independently. How many? That's okay. We're going to check ourselves because I heard a 4 and I heard a 5. But this time when we check ourselves, we're going to check ourselves a little bit differently. This time when we say the word independently, this is going to be weird. Rich, you love weird, right? Yes. We're good with weird. We're going to keep our mouths closed. And we're going to say the word independently with our mouth closed. Are we ready? Let's do this together. Ready? How many syllables? 5. So we checked ourselves. 5. Teaching tip. Some kids have trouble clapping syllables. Close their mouth. I saw it on Twitter. It has to be true. Okay. Independently. Right? Say it with me. Independently. Great. All right. So again, we're going to break this word down a little bit, and we're just going to study that first part. What's the first syllable? In. All right, let's stretch it out. I. N. How many sounds? 2. I. N. Do this with me. I. N. Okay, 2 sounds. I. What letter makes the I sound? N. Okay, nice. All right. In. In. Okay. We're going to pause that for a second. All right. So I'd go maybe do a little more of that independently. All right. So when we think about the word independently, do you know any words inside that word? Parts of that word? Depend. I heard you say depend. Yeah. Have you heard of the word depend? So if I depend on somebody, I rely on them to help me think or do something, right? Yes, you guys are awake after lunch. Yes. If I depend on somebody, I rely on them to help me think or help me do something, right? So in is actually a prefix that means not, right? So if depend means I rely on somebody to help me think or do something, and the word in, or excuse me, the prefix in means not, turn to somebody at your table and think about what independent might mean. Go ahead and talk. So I heard you say not rely on somebody else to think or do something. So who am I going to rely on? Myself. Okay, so independently. Okay, we're going to take this a notch further. This is so cool. We love language. Don't we love language in this classroom? We love words. Independent is an adjective. Yes? In the text you're about to read is this sentence: students engage in independent practice, grappling with high-quality, grade-appropriate text, tasks, and materials. What kind of practice? Independent practice. Practice is a noun. Independent is describing the noun, so it's an adjective, right? I know. Wait for it. Wait for it. When we add ly to independent, we not only get a new word, but we get a new part of speech. What do we get? An adverb. Check this out. As students are working independently. How are they working? Independently. What is working? Working is a verb, independently. And now we have an adverb. It's so cool, right? New word, new part of speech, new function in the sentence, how that word functions in the sentence, right? Takes on a new meaning. I know. Give me jazz hands. Go ahead. Woo! This is amazing. All right, let's stop. Now I'm going to stop being your 5th grade teacher, and you're going to be the instructional leaders that you are. And now we're going to sort of analyze this task, okay? To do that, I want you to go back to page 9. I want you to look at your standards map. Remember I told you we'd go back to that EE map and we'd go back to our standards map? Okay, page 9. What I'm going to invite you to do is think about the task that you just witnessed in that 5th grade classroom in relation to the standards map, okay? If I can get to it. Let's start with the strand. Foundation strand. Did you see an example of foundational work in that lesson? Okay, great. Now, we know in the foundational strand for grades 4 and 5, or 3, 4, and 5, we're not going to look at, we only have one standard, by the way. So we don't have to eliminate standards, right? But now we have to say to ourselves, was that phonics and word analysis that I saw? Or was it fluency? Or was it both? Okay. We didn't really practice fluency, did we? All right. So let's make a note to say, okay, there's a benchmark in 5th grade around phonics and word analysis. So I'm going to look at that benchmark. Okay. Let's keep going. Reading strand. Did we do any reading work, really? Not really. No. Right? So let's ignore that because we weren't reading prose and poetry. We weren't really reading informational text except for one sentence. We weren't reading across a genre. Now let's go to communication. Were we communicating through writing? No. Were we doing handwriting, narrative writing, argument, right? No. Were we communicating oral? Can we just ixnay that? Move on. Were we doing any vocabulary work? Were we finding meaning? Okay, so that's the standard, right? Were we focusing on academic vocabulary? Morphology. Okay. So now what I want to invite you to do is go to your 5th grade standard, and you've marked that with your page, and I want you to find the foundational benchmark that matches the instruction and student practice that you just witnessed in that 5th grade class. And I want you to invite you to do the same thing for vocabulary. Okay? When you know you've found one benchmark, put your thumb up. Nice. Yep. All right. So one of the things that we just did is we simulated you walking into a classroom, a 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade classroom, and seeing something. And that not did what did we do, but what did I just see, right? And then we started with the standards map, and we said strand first. What strand, what standard, what benchmark? And then you went to the grade level, and I directed you to 5th. That was a big help, but you probably know when you walk into a classroom what grade level you're in, right? So that's not a big giveaway. And then standard focus, benchmark focus. And then, so let's take a look. So also, coding system, right? ELA, grade, strand, standard, benchmark, which is this, right? Now let's look at what it says. Did we apply knowledge of letter sound correspondences? Yeah, so we actually did some of that work, kind of taking the syllables and breaking them down, and then identifying the letters that represented the sounds, right? We didn't finish it, but we started it. I mean, we fast-forwarded syllabication, morphology, and then what about vocabulary? I want to draw the attention to the bolded part because I think thus far, in lessons that I've seen, we tend to identify the meaning of the affix, right? But not necessarily how it changes the part of speech, which is something that's called out in 5th grade, right? The idea that the connection between affixes and parts of speech, because This part here, this foundational standard, is about kids approaching words that they might not know and decoding those words, right? And when they're decoding those words and figuring those words out, they use letter-sound correspondences, right? They use syllables and syllable divisions, and they also use meaning, right? Word parts to figure out how to decode the word. This benchmark shifts to vocabulary, meaning I approach a word, I might be able to decode the word, but I don't know what it means, right? But the idea that we can use base words, Greek and Latin roots, we can use word parts to help us understand what this word might mean. And that includes parts of speech. If I know that an ly word is an adverb, it helps me kind of figure out what that word might mean. Does that make sense? And so, okay. Pretty cool, huh? Fun. More fun in store. Ready? We're going to move to instructional task number 2. And instructional task number 2, I'm actually going to give you the text that I promised, which is an excerpt, a very short excerpt from the teaching and learning book around the teaching of reading. And so when you get your text, just read it for the gist, skim it. And one of the things I want you to be thinking about is some relevant, I'll give you 4, details related to the teaching of reading. Scott, did I give, sorry, I'm counting, it's not. You can use your highlighter, you can use your Post-its, check mark, put a star. Okay, for time's sake, in my 5th grade classroom, time is going to elapse. No, not elapse. What are we going to do? Yeah, zoom forward. We're going to skip some parts of the instruction. In this part, what I want you to think about is rereading. And which of these ideas would you say the author of the text would most likely agree with? Idea 1, the teaching of reading is highly complex, akin to a rocket scientist or an ER doctor. Or bullet 2, the gradual release of responsibility model is important in a reading classroom. What I want to say to a room full of leaders, there is no right or wrong answer, okay? There's evidence to support both. But you need to take a side, okay? So take a side. Which claim would you say the author most likely agrees with? And then find some evidence to support your claim. Reasons, evidence, okay? Just take a couple of minutes. We're going to fast forward this part too, but both of these are correct. I don't want anybody to stress out. Again, I'm going to fast forward to this Padlet. If you would take a picture with your phone, this is going to ask you to take one side or the other, and just using the Padlet, you would enter it into the first column or the second column, and just on your Post-it, put a piece of text evidence that supports your claim. ER doctor, gradual release. Oh my gosh, we're running out of time, you guys. We're going to just skip this part. And we're going to just go to the debrief, all right? Go back to your instructional map on page 9. Ask yourself, did we engage in foundational work in this task itself, right? When we just read with kind of relevant details in mind and making a claim and the author's purpose, find a benchmark or two, again, that matches the work we did. Again, for time's sake, I'm going to fast forward us in the process. By the way, Nell Duke, who is a reading researcher, and she's a professor at the University of Michigan, writes a couple of articles about how important the gradual release model is in an ELA classroom, but also she writes about how teaching reading is like being a rocket scientist or an ER doctor. So these are benchmarks you may have linked to in your reading strand, right? In your communication strand. By the way, there is a technology and communication benchmark that calls for kids to use digital writing tools. You use Padlet, right? ELA expectations, don't forget those. Did we not have to cite evidence? Did we not have to make inferences? Last but not least, I wanted to call our attention back to the agenda. We work together, and I hope that you become more familiar with the standards map, the benchmarks, and the clarifications to fully understand the expected outcomes for students. I hope you are deepen your understanding of combining and stacking standards, and then that you're walking away understanding how to analyze tasks. So when you walk into a classroom and you wonder, is this standards-based instruction, right? How tightly is this related? That you can use that standards page or your standards app on CPALMs to look at the strand, the standard, and the benchmark. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.